December 17, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay cloaked in ice and silence. Snow fell like ash upon the wreckage of German panzers frozen in ambush, their engines dead, their crews staring westward toward a front that had already moved beyond their reach. Inside a shattered farmhouse near St. Vith, a group of German soldiers huddled around a guttering lantern. Their rations were gone. The last fuel truck hadn't arrived in 3 days. Through the cracked window, they could see the faint orange glow on the horizon. American artillery batteries firing all night, every night, without pause. One soldier whispered that the Americans must have endless shells. Another muttered, "They have supply lines we cannot break." That quiet statement, buried in frost and despair, summed up the secret of the war's final winter. The Battle of the Bulge had begun as Hitler's final gamble, a surprise offensive meant to split the Allied lines and reach Antwerp before Christmas. For a brief moment, it worked. On December 16th, 3 German armies, over 400,000 men, smashed into thin American defenses in the Ardennes. Panzer divisions rolled through the fog, Tiger tanks crushed frozen roads beneath their treads, and the Luftwaffe clawed at gray skies in one last show of strength. But from the very first day, the offensive carried a fatal flaw. The German supply train was broken before the first shell was fired. Fuel, ammunition, and food were measured in hours, not days. What they faced across the lines was not just an army. It was an industrial machine, a living network that could feed, clothe, and arm itself faster than any nation in history. When the first German thrust reached the American town of St. Vith, the defenders, men from the 106th Infantry Division, were already being resupplied by convoys rolling from the west. Trucks from Red Ball Express columns arrived through sleet and mud, headlights blacked out, but engines roaring. Drivers, many of them African-American volunteers, carried fuel cans, rations, and ammunition crates through the night. Behind them stretched an unbroken ribbon of logistics that began not in France, but in New York, where Liberty ships unloaded at Cherbourg and Le Havre around the clock. Every bullet that crossed the Atlantic was another nail in the coffin of the Wehrmacht. German officers captured near Bastogne later told interrogators that it was as if America's factories themselves were on the battlefield. By contrast, the German columns bled fuel with every mile. Tank commanders rationed their movements to conserve gasoline. Staff cars were abandoned in the snow. In a diary recovered from a panzer officer near Hofelice, one line stood out: "We advance on hope, not on fuel." Hope, however, was not a renewable resource. The American response was swift and merciless. When General Eisenhower ordered Patton's Third Army to pivot north toward Bastogne, the order traveled in minutes through field radios powered by mobile generators and signal trucks. In less than 48 hours, entire divisions were on the move. Mechanics worked through blizzards, loading Sherman tanks onto transporters, refueling convoys every 50 miles. Even in snowstorms that grounded planes, the U.S. Army's logistical grid functioned like a living organism, each road, rail line, and depot feeding another. A war fought over terrain had become a war of movement and resupply, and in that contest, America was unbeatable. The difference lay not only in numbers but also in philosophy. The U.S. Army treated supply as strategy, not support. Quartermasters were trained as combat planners. Engineers built depots like fortresses. In northern France, vast fuel farms of jerrycans were stacked like miniature cities. Pipeline crews laid the legendary PLUTO pipeline under the ocean, carrying fuel directly from Britain to Normandy beaches. From there, the Red Ball Express kept it flowing to the front at a rate of over 12,000 tons a day. Each truck driver knew that delay meant death for someone ahead. One veteran later recalled, "We weren't soldiers. We were arteries." The Germans, by contrast, relied on horse carts, commandeered civilian trucks, and dwindling rail lines bombed daily by Allied aircraft. They were fighting a 20th century war with a 19th century backbone. Inside the German high command, frustration turned to disbelief. Hitler's staff demanded to know why captured American fuel dumps could not sustain the offensive. The answer was simple. The Americans burned more gasoline in a day than the Germans could capture in a week. German logistics officers, trained in precision and order, found themselves improvising like scavengers, draining abandoned tanks, melting snow for water, and loading captured jeeps with jerrycans. When their radios went silent from power loss, some units resorted to bicycle couriers. The image of an army once feared for its mechanized precision, now reduced to pedal-driven messengers, became a cruel metaphor for its collapse. At Bastogne. The snowstorm that grounded the Luftwaffe also grounded American resupply aircraft, but only for a day. By December 23rd, the clouds cleared, and C-47 Skytrans roared overhead, dropping canisters of food and ammunition directly into the besieged town. The German soldiers watching from the treeline saw parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the gray sky. To them, it was a vision of impossibility. The Americans could conjure supplies from the heavens. In field reports captured after the battle, one German officer described it as a miracle of the enemy. It wasn't a miracle. It was logistics perfected through machinery, mathematics, and manpower. Behind the front, tens of thousands of workers and mechanics labored in frozen depots. African-American engineers repaired vehicles by torchlight, while women back home in Detroit and Pittsburgh operated production lines that never slept. Every Jeep engine and artillery shell that arrived in Belgium was a testament to an invisible army of civilians and technicians. Even the gasoline itself carried an industrial story, refined in Texas, shipped across the Atlantic, pumped through depots, trucked across France, and poured into a Sherman tank in a single continuous motion. No empire in history had ever sustained such reach. When war correspondent Ernie Pyle visited a supply base near Verdun, he wrote that the real weapon of the American soldier was the chain that feeds him. For the German soldiers trapped in the Ardennes, every mile westward felt heavier than the last. Their panzers were steel beasts starved of oil. Their rifles froze in the cold. Wounded men lay in barns with no morphine, no blankets, no hope. Commanders sent desperate messages to Berlin asking for fuel that no longer existed. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had marched across Europe with mechanical precision, now moved on foot through snowdrifts, hunted by an enemy that never ran out of motion. When American supply trucks rolled through the retaken towns, children came out to watch, the engines rumbling like the sound of inevitability itself. By early January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed entirely. The Ardennes became a graveyard of twisted armor and burnt convoys. The few surviving German soldiers who surrendered were astonished to see American depots overflowing with fuel drums, bread, and cigarettes even after weeks of battle. One prisoner reportedly muttered to his captor, "You cannot beat a country that has this much." His words were more prophecy than surrender. Germany's defeat was no longer measured in territory lost, but in the realization that its enemy could replace everything: men, machines, and hope, faster than it could destroy them. As the last German units retreated east through the snow, they left behind not just weapons, but illusions. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht died not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet rumble of engines that never stopped. Somewhere in the chaos, a German private wrote home to his mother, telling her not to worry, that Germany would find its strength again when spring came. But spring never came for the Reich. The endless American supply lines had crushed not only their armies but also their belief in endurance itself. And as the frozen forests of Belgium thawed under the rising sun, the echoes of that lesson carried across the world. Wars are not won by courage alone, but by the power to keep moving when everything else stops. The Germans called it unbeatable. They were right. The secret behind America's unbeatable supply lines was not luck, but engineering. Hidden behind every convoy, every depot, and every fuel drum was a system born in the laboratories, shipyards, and factories of an industrial giant that had transformed logistics into a weapon. It was not the thunder of artillery or the speed of tanks that truly broke the German war machine. It was the mathematics of movement and the rhythm of resupply. Germany's generals had underestimated not America's soldiers, but its engineers. In 1943, long before the Ardennes, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps began developing the logistical backbone for an invasion they knew would stretch across an entire continent. Engineers from General Motors, Ford, and Studebaker collaborated to design trucks that could endure thousands of miles of unpaved roads. The result was the legendary 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, known simply as the Deuce and a Half. It could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo at 45 miles per hour, climb gradients of 40%, and operate in temperatures from the deserts of North Africa to the snows of Belgium. Factories in Detroit, Pontiac, and Flint produced nearly 500,000 of them before the war's end. These trucks became the arteries of the Allied advance. Simple, rugged, and unstoppable, supporting them was an equally vast fleet of maintenance units. In France, mobile repair depots operated like field hospitals for machinery. Broken engines were stripped, rebuilt, and sent back into service within days. American mechanics carried catalogs thicker than Bibles, listing every spare part down to the last bolt. At Verdun, an entire forest was converted into a motor pool, rows upon rows of vehicles under camouflage nets, each marked for specific frontline units. The German army had no equivalent. Their panzers were marvels of engineering, but nightmares of maintenance. Every Tiger or Panther required specialized tools, unique spare parts, and massive fuel consumption. The Americans had chosen reliability over perfection, and in the long grind of war, that choice decided everything. The scale of American supply astonished even their own officers. By late 1944, over 700,000 tons of supplies were being delivered monthly across Western Europe. Trains carried munitions from the ports of Cherbourg and Antwerp to distribution hubs at Chartres and Liège. From there, truck convoys fanned out along marked supply highways. Traffic was so constant that MPs used colored flags instead of signs to manage the flow. If one route was bombed or blocked, alternate paths opened within hours. Even fuel, the lifeblood of the modern army, had its own miracle, pipeline networks that stretched behind the front lines like veins of steel. The PLUTO system, first laid across the English Channel in 1944, pumped over 1 million gallons of gasoline per day into Europe. American engineers kept building new extensions, ensuring that by the time the Ardennes offensive began, Allied armies were literally running on a river of oil. Meanwhile, German industry was collapsing under the weight of its own complexity. Luftwaffe fuel consumption exceeded production by late 1944, forcing the grounding of training squadrons. Rail lines, bombed daily by Allied air forces, could no longer transport munitions from the Ruhr to the front. The once proud organization TOT, responsible for building the Atlantic Wall, was now dismantling bridges to salvage steel. To make matters worse, Germany's synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Politz were shattered by precision bombing. What little fuel remained was reserved for a shrinking number of tanks and aircraft. For the first time, German commanders were told that victory was subject to gasoline. It was the death sentence of an industrial empire. Technology alone did not make America's supply network invincible. It was the human architecture behind it. Over 23,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps as clerks, drivers, and logistics planners. At SHAF headquarters, they calculated tonnage requirements for each division, mapping out supply forecasts weeks in advance. African-American drivers of the Red Ball Express worked grueling 16-hour shifts, sleeping in their cabs when the road was too dangerous to stop. They delivered 412,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months after D-Day, often under fire. Many of them joked that they fought the war with grease, gasoline, and grit. But their determination became the pulse of victory. Without them, no tank would have moved, no shell would have been fired, and no soldier would have eaten. German intelligence tried to make sense of it all. Reports captured after the war show stunned analyses of the American system. One Wehrmacht officer wrote that their front lines seemed connected by iron chains to the factories of their homeland. Another described how captured depots contained enough rations to feed an entire German corps for weeks. The disbelief bordered on admiration. In a dramatized composite from an interrogation record, a captured German major confessed, "We thought we were fighting an army. We were fighting a factory that could shoot." For the first time, the myth of German industrial superiority had been shattered, not by better weapons, but by better organization. One of the defining moments came during the siege of Bastogne. When the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, the Germans believed starvation and cold would force surrender. Instead, the Americans adapted. On December 23rd, when the weather cleared, waves of C-47s from the 9 Troop Carrier Command delivered over 350 tons of supplies by air, ammunition, rations, and even medical kits. Ground crews loaded cargo at airfields in Reims and Châteaudun with clockwork precision, while pilots flew through flak corridors using radio beacons. German soldiers watched helplessly as American paratroopers waved and cheered each incoming drop. The message was unmistakable. The Americans could not be starved. The same day, Patton's Third Army broke through from the south, bringing truck convoys filled with food and fuel. The ring closed, and the German advance died in the snow. Behind the front lines, the American logistics machine evolved faster than any in history. Data analysts, then called operations researchers, used slide rules to predict ammunition expenditure, fuel needs, and casualty rates. Their models adjusted convoy schedules in real time, a primitive precursor to computer-based warfare. In depots near Liège, refrigeration engineers maintained field kitchens that could feed entire divisions with hot meals. The Army Service Forces employed over 1.2 million men and women across Europe, most of whom never saw combat, but determined who survived it. The war was being fought as much by spreadsheets as by soldiers. Germany could not replicate this miracle. Its factories lay in ruins, its engineers were drafted into infantry, and its drains were without coal. What little reached the front came too later was too little. Even elite formations like the Panzerlehr Division found themselves immobilized for lack of diesel. A captured dispatch from December 1944 recorded a chilling statistic. The division had only enough fuel for 2 hours of combat movement. When the last drops were gone, the tanks were abandoned, their crews fighting on foot against a mechanized tide. The myth of the Blitzkrieg ended where the supply lines stopped. By January 1945, American logistics had turned war into geometry. Every ton of material was calculated, every convoy timed to the minute. Generals no longer asked if something could be done, they asked how fast it could be delivered. The engine of victory was running at full throttle, and its sound echoed across the frozen Ardennes. German soldiers crouching in the snow listened to that mechanical hum, the endless grind of trucks, cranes, and engines, and knew what it meant. They were not just outnumbered. They were outsupplied, outbuilt, and outlasted. And as that realization spread through the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht, the phrase whispered in bunkers and trenches grew heavier with truth. The American supply lines were not merely strong. They were unbeatable. WWII February 1945. The snow that once hid German armor now revealed only wreckage. Tanks rusting in thawing mud. Trucks stripped for parts, and soldiers trudging through slush where fuel convoys had failed to arrive. Across the Rhine, the Americans moved with clockwork precision. Their columns of trucks and armor advanced like a tide, refueled by a system that had grown to mythic scale. In Berlin's war rooms, officers marked maps with black pins where supply routes had collapsed, their briefings shrinking from offensives to withdrawals. For every German soldier still fighting, there were 3 waiting for rations that never came. The words whispered in the trenches, "unbeatable supply lines," had become prophecy fulfilled. The Wehrmacht's morale decayed as fast as its fuel reserves. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, German infantrymen confessed that they were dying for lack of bread, not bullets. Units that once advanced with confidence now hesitated, fearing they might be ordered to attack without tanks or ammunition. Entire regiments moved by night to scavenge food from abandoned farms. By contrast, American soldiers feasted by comparison, fresh bread from mobile bakeries, coffee brewed in field kitchens, and warm rations delivered even under shell fire. It was more than comfort. It was psychology. An army that ate, moved, and communicated better was an army that believed it could not lose. The psychological gulf widened with every retreat. When the Germans pulled back from the Ardennes and later the Saar region, they left behind not only material but also identity. The myth of the disciplined, self-sufficient soldier, the ideal forged in the campaigns of 1940, was gone. The diaries of German soldiers captured in early 1945 described disbelief turning into bitterness. One panzer mechanic wrote that the Americans do not fight like men, they fight like machines that never sleep. Another lamented that their mothers had sent them to war believing the fatherland's might would protect them. Now, those mothers were shivering in bombed-out apartments, listening to radio broadcasts that spoke only of strategic withdrawals. Hope was becoming an orphan, Meanwhile, American logistics had become an empire in motion. As the front lines surged eastward, new depots appeared behind them like shadows. At Verdun, a single supply base processed 13,000 tons of fuel and ammunition every day. Portable bridges built by the Corps of Engineers crossed rivers before the infantry reached the banks. Railway units repaired captured German tracks overnight, bringing fresh shipments straight from Antwerp. Military historians would later call it the rolling front, a phenomenon where supply and strategy moved as one. It was a concept Germany could never replicate, and by the time they understood it, the war had already outgrown them. What made this machine so extraordinary was the network of minds that sustained it. Behind every gallon of gasoline was an accountant calculating logistics curves, a dispatcher routing trucks, and a welder repairing pipelines. Civilians across the United States, the invisible workforce of the arsenal of democracy, had woven themselves into the battlefield through steel and steam. Workers in Detroit could tell which fronts were advancing by the orders they received. A sudden request for tank tracks meant movement in France. A rush for cold weather gear meant another push into the mountains. War had become an equation, and America's engineers were solving it one shipment at a time. The Red Ball Express became the legend that symbolized this triumph. Its drivers, most of them young, exhausted, and underappreciated, kept the front alive through storms and shelling. They used makeshift maps marked with chalk, navigating roads cratered by bombs. When bridges collapsed, they built new ones from fallen trees. Their motto, painted on the doors of their trucks, was simple: through rain, through hell, through enemy fire. And they delivered. By the time the last column crossed into Germany, those convoys had carried more than 500,000 tons of supplies. It was a number that defied comprehension, and it made the word unbeatable sound less like pride and more like arithmetic. Germany's collapse was not just military but mechanical. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly in strength. Its pilots sat grounded beside empty fuel drums. The famed Tiger tanks, once symbols of invincibility, were abandoned en masse because their engines had seized or their crews had no fuel to retreat. German engineers resorted to converting vehicles to run on wood gasifiers, a desperate measure that reduced mobility to a crawl. One report from the German Armaments Ministry noted grimly, "We have perfected machines we can no longer power." It was the ultimate irony. Technology had outpaced sustenance. The Reich had built an army too sophisticated for the world. It was collapsing into .in March 1945. The Rhine became the last great test of supply and endurance. The Americans built floating pontoon bridges under enemy fire, moving entire armored divisions across within days. Fuel tankers lined the riverbanks, pumping gasoline directly into forward depots. General Patton famously urinated into the Rhine as a symbolic gesture, but his real victory was logistical. His army crossed because it never stopped moving. The Germans watching from the East Bank realized that even rivers could not slow their enemy anymore. They faced not just a military adversary, but a civilization in motion. As American convoys rolled deeper into Germany, the scenes they encountered revealed the human cost of industrial starvation. Civilians gathered around wrecked trains searching for scraps of coal. Children begged soldiers for food. Factories stood gutted, their chimneys cold, their furnaces silent. The same workers who once forged tanks for the Wehrmacht now scavenged metal for stoves. A captured German logistics officer told his interrogators that the war had ended for him long before Berlin fell. The day the last fuel truck didn't come. In that single sentence lay the truth of total war, without movement. Even empires die standing still for the Allied command. The success of the supply chain was more than a wartime miracle. It was a lesson that would shape the next century. Military colleges studied the campaign as a case study in logistics supremacy. During the Cold War, the same doctrines reappeared under new names: forward supply, sustainment operations, and network-centric warfare. The idea that victory belonged to those who could project power the farthest became gospel. In later conflicts, from Korea to the Persian Gulf, the spirit of the Red Ball Express lived on in convoys, airlifts, and satellite-guided supply grids. The battlefield of the future had been born in the mud of Belgium. Yet beneath the triumph, there lingered a quieter legacy. Many of the American soldiers who watched the German retreat felt pity instead of pride. They saw young men barely older than themselves surrendering in exhaustion, their boots falling apart, their weapons rusted. In captured towns, German mothers wept as American supply trucks rolled through streets once decorated with swastikas. Some offered flowers. Others simply stared at the endless lines of fuel and food passing them by. They understood then what their sons had meant when they rode home. The Americans were not men of war in the old sense. They were builders, movers, and sustainers. And that was what made them unstoppable. When Germany finally capitulated in May 1945, the last message sent from the remnants of the Wehrmacht's logistics division was terse and resigned, supplies exhausted, units immobile. It was both a report and an obituary. The same message could have been carved on the Empire's gravestone. In the ruins of Berlin, amid smoke and rubble, an American convoy rumbled through the Tiergarten toward the Brandenburg Gate, engines humming, tires hissing on wet pavement. The sound was not loud, but it carried like thunder through a silent city. From that silence emerged the final truth of the war. Courage could win battles, but only logistics could win wars. The American supply lines had done more than feed armies. They had broken an empire's will, crushed its illusions, and rewritten the rules of modern warfare. The men who once called those lines unbeatable were right, though they could never have imagined how literal that truth would become. And as Europe's fires dimmed and peace returned, one lesson remained eternal. Nations fall not when their guns go silent, but when their engines stop. In the end, victory belongs to those who can keep moving when the world around them cannot.